Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Queen of the West, The Life and Times of Dale Evans, by Theresa Kaminski, narrated by Kitty Hendrix. Publisher's note: this audiobook may refer to visual elements included in the print and e-book editions of the book. Celebrity. Noun. A famous person. The state of being famous. Chapter 1. My heart is down Texas way. Young Francis. In the bright April spring of 1928, 15-year-old Frances Fox set out on a 60-mile trip from Blytheville, Arkansas, south to Memphis, Tennessee. With her brother-in-law at the wheel and his wife in the passenger seat, Frances and her 5-month-old son Tommy nestled in the back seat of the automobile for the long journey. The teenaged mom could not wait to visit her mother, Betty Sue Smith, over the Easter holiday. During a time of celebration for rebirth and renewal, Frances hoped to repair the rocky relationships in her life. At this young age, she had experienced more than her fair share. Frances may have been feeling guilty that her behavior over the last 18 months, eloping at 14 and having a baby not long after turning 15, had caused the final crack in her parents' already stressful marriage. Betty Sue Smith, normally a traditionalist when it came to marital unions, had recently divorced her husband Walter after 16 years of marriage. She took Frances's younger brother Hillman and moved from Osceola, Arkansas to Memphis. A deeply religious woman, raised in the Baptist faith, Betty Sue felt conflicted over the situation. She understood a wife's duty to her husband, but she had a mind of her own. Betty Sue decided that duty did not include staying with an unreliable, unrepentant gambler who might make the family homeless. Yet she probably hoped the divorce, finalized 3 weeks before the birth of her grandson in November 1927, would convince Walter to give up his vice to get his family back. After the divorce, Betty Sue decided against moving to Uvalde, Texas, where her own parents and extended family lived. Instead, she chose Memphis, where her daughter Frances and son-in-law Tom Fox settled, not long after their hasty marriage in April 1926. As a child, Frances Smith had been precocious, but outright rebelliousness did not set in until shortly before Tom came on the scene. Frances inherited her mother's strong will and pushed it to the next level. Where Betty Sue gently but firmly stretched some of the boundaries that limited women's lives, Frances crashed right through them. But the mother was always there for her daughter. Betty Sue Wood, usually called Sue or Sister, was born in East Texas in 1889 and raised in a family of staunch Baptists during the late 19th century. Despite her father Charles's religious faith, he loved music and insisted that all his 7 daughters take lessons. Betty Sue, the eldest, played the piano well, but not enthusiastically. Still, inspired by her father's resistance to religious restrictions on music, she later struck out with her own form of rebellion. At the end of the 1890s, Charles Wood moved the family to Uvalde, around 85 miles west of San Antonio, settling on 40 acres of land on Fort Clark Road. Betty Sue grew up as a broadly based progressive movement was taking root in the United States, chipping away at Victorian attitudes about sexuality and gender roles. Educational and work opportunities expanded for young, white, middle-class women. As more women opted to continue their educations beyond high school, they faced a choice of either using that education to pursue a career or applying it to more efficient housekeeping. Even women themselves frowned at the suggestion that they could or should do both simultaneously. Jane Addams, who founded the Chicago settlement house known as Hull House the year Betty Sue was born, became the model progressive woman, well-educated and devoted to a social work career of helping others. Like many other settlement house workers, Adams never married. Progressive women supported the suffrage movement, which in the 1890s briskly pushed a Votes for Women campaign. In Texas, however, the drive for women's voting rights fell flat. In the 1860s and 1870s, state politicians rejected attempts to add women's suffrage to the state constitution. Though a Texas Equal Rights Association organized in Dallas in 1893, it lasted only 3 years. In 1903, while Betty Sue Wood attended high school, an equal suffrage league sprang up in Houston. It, too, proved short-lived. Conservative tradition ran deep in Texas. Very few women cared about casting a ballot. They did not see what voting had to do with their purview of marriage and family. By the time Betty Sue graduated from college in 1908, only one suffrage group, in Austin, existed in the state. Even if she supported the cause, it is unlikely any suffrage advocates existed at the schools she chose to attend. As Frances Smith later remarked about her mother, "Something slipped somewhere." And Betty Sue rebelled from her parents' Baptist faith by enrolling in Texas Presbyterian College. Located about 300 miles north of Uvalde in Milford, the school, which opened in 1902 to educate Christian women for Christian homes, required all students to complete 2 years of Bible classes. One day on campus, the pretty young woman met Walter Hillman Smith, the brother of a classmate. Walter, 3 years Betty Sue's senior, hailed from a prosperous Baptist family of merchants and farmers in Centerville, Mississippi. For 2 years, he attended the all-male Mississippi College in Clinton, run by the Mississippi Baptist Convention. The Smith family developed ties to the institution. Walter was named for one of its past presidents, Walter Hillman. Despite Baptist prohibitions, Walter Smith loved to dance and cut a rug at every opportunity. Great serendipity, then, that Betty Sue played the piano so well. After college, the young Miss Wood moved back to Uvalde and taught school. Since the early 1800s, teaching had been viewed as a respectable occupation for women, but not a lifelong career. Most women regarded it as a practical application of their own higher education, a wage-earning way station between young adulthood and marriage. Betty Sue's bridge period lasted about 2 years. She wed Walter Smith in 1911, and they settled on the Wood family cotton farm in Uvalde. On October 31, 1912, she gave birth to her first child, a daughter they named Frances Octavia. The labor proved difficult for Betty Sue, and the doctor put her in a twilight sleep, which may have accounted for the misinformation supplied on Frances's birth certificate. Someone listed the date of birth as October 30th, and the name of the child as Lucille Wood Smith. For the first 3 days of her life, and maybe for the only time in her young life, baby Frances stayed quiet. The doctors and the nurses were sure that I was an abnormal child, she later recalled. When I finally came to, I made up for lost time with a racket that upset the whole hospital. Mother says that I've been making myself heard ever since. With a growing family, Walter Smith looked to earn a more stable income than farming provided. He and his brother-in-law opened a hardware store in the town of Italy in Ellis County, about 330 miles north of Uvalde. Surrounded by farms, growing cotton, corn, and wheat. Italy was small but growing. Just over 1,000 people lived there in 1900, and the population inched up to about 1,300 in 1920. Much of that increase in residents was due to the economic benefits the Missouri-Kansas-Texas Railroad brought. The line stopped in Italy, ensuring the farmers could get their crops to market and bringing in the modern consumer items they needed. The town's thriving commerce made Walter's store profitable enough that he and Betty Sue expanded their family. In March 1916, when Frances was 3 years old, her parents presented her with a baby brother named after his father, and called Hillman, or son. For the young Smith siblings, the Wood family farm in Uvalde became a place to visit on weekends and summer vacations. All of Texas seemed like a grand romance in those days, so wild and free, Frances later recalled. It represented the place of her heart. She found plenty there to occupy her days. If there was a pony around, I rode that. If not, I found a goat to ride. I rode anything I could get astraddle. She fished in and roamed the banks of the Nueces River, which was so clear you could see the fish below and the rocks at the bottom. Frances spent plenty of time with the extended Wood family, too. She remembered how Granddaddy used to popcorn at night, read the Bible, and have family prayer, and insist that all the children and grandchildren eat an orange or an apple with him at bedtime. Everyone gathered in the large dining room, where the big, happy family enjoyed old-fashioned, home-cooked meals and wonderful fellowship and quiet respect for my grandparents. A dozen doting aunts and uncles pronounced Frances cute and clever. The little girl agreed, and she quickly learned how to cultivate admiration. When someone gave me new clothes, I pirouetted in front of the mirror, a la the greatest actress in the world, she admitted. She burst into song at the drop of a hat, and more than once during Sunday church services, I broke away from my parents when the lively gospel songs were sung, and danced down the aisle of the church. Swift spankings from her father failed to curtail this behavior. While Betty Sue's youth took place during the Progressive era and the Votes for Women's Suffrage campaign, Frances's early years coincided with the United States' participation in World War I and the final push for the 19th Amendment, which conferred voting rights on most American women. In September 1918, 32-year-old Walter Smith registered for the draft, but did not receive a call-up for military service. The family lost no one in the war or from the influenza pandemic that swept worldwide in 1918. Betty Sue still demonstrated no interest in suffrage, even though Texas women received the right to vote in primary elections in 1918. In May 1919, male voters in the state refused to ratify a proposed amendment to the Texas Constitution that would grant women the right to vote in all elections. On June 28th, after the U.S. Congress finally passed the 19th Amendment, Texas became the first Southern state to ratify the women's suffrage amendment. The remainder of the required 36 states completed the process by August. As a child, Frances Smith would have been unaware or unconcerned about these national and international events. Through her eyes, everything in her life was perfect, or nearly so. After the move to Italy, the little girl cycled through a variety of childhood illnesses, including diphtheria, a contagious bacterial infection. The disease temporarily paralyzed Frances's palate, an uncommon development in the third week of its progression. The paralysis was frightening enough that she remembered it decades later. Frances also may not have known why her parents established separate households. In January 1920, federal census takers counted the Smith family in 2 locations. Betty Sue's residence, for which she was listed as head of the household, showed her living in Uvalde with Frances and Hillman. Walter was identified as head of the household of rented quarters in Italy, Texas. The 2 domiciles likely indicated a troubled marriage. Perhaps Betty Sue believed living apart from Walter would protect the economic well-being of the family, giving her more control over the money that her husband might gamble away. Yet she did not consider the marriage finished. Later that year, when Walter Smith decided to work with his brother in Arkansas, Betty Sue agreed to move with him. Maybe she believed a more isolated location would keep her husband out of trouble. But Frances recalled her father as a man who always thought the grass was greener somewhere else. This time, the lure was a long staple cotton farm located midway between Osceola and Luxura in northeast Arkansas, along the banks of the Mississippi River. The Smiths settled into a small frame house on the property, a simple structure that, like others in rural locations throughout the country, lacked electricity. Frances and Hillman made friends with two black children of the sharecropping family that also worked the land. The young foursome spent countless hours outside playing games. Betty Sue and Walter gave their offspring one non-negotiable rule, one that introduced them to racial segregation. "We could play together outside all we wished," Frances remembered. "But that was it, and all of it. They never came into our house, and we never went into theirs. We children never discussed this. We knew that it was expected of us, and we accepted it." Jim Crow laws dominated the American South in the early 20th century. The legalized separation of the races began after the defeat of the Confederacy in the Civil War. Southern whites, deprived of the institution of slavery that once formed the backbone of their economic, political, and social systems, now cemented their power through discrimination and segregation. The Supreme Court allowed states to establish literacy tests and poll taxes for voters, which were unfairly applied to African Americans. Whites-only signs appeared on public facilities, including water fountains, restrooms, and schools. Children like Frances learned about the color line from a young age. Opposition to these racialized laws already existed, especially within black communities, and would gain power and strength throughout the 20th century. Betty Sue and Walter Smith enrolled their daughter in public school in the Mississippi County seat of Osceola, a town with a population of about 1,700. Like Italy, Texas, Osceola thrived because of its proximity to a railroad line. It boasted a bustling town square and a business district that lined its main street, Hale Avenue. At 7 years old, Frances ended up in a third-grade classroom, advanced because she already knew the alphabet and how to count. She got along well with her older classmates, despite the age difference, though she later lamented, "Children are children for such a short time. We can skip too much in human experience, skip too many valuable experiences." The little girl enjoyed the intellectual challenge the skipping grades provided, and she threw herself into schoolwork. Frances diligently completed homework, scored well on exams, and engaged in extracurricular activities. A religious component complemented her formal education. "We recited the Lord's Prayer in the classroom every morning, and on Fridays we had chapel with singing, Bible reading, prayer, and a minister from a different church to talk to us," she recalled. When Frances turned 8, she began piano lessons with Flavia Driver, who had studied at the Southern Conservatory of Music in Memphis. Betty Sue Smith insisted, like her father before her, that girls needed music instruction. Frances did not need convincing. She loved music. As she remembered, "It went well for a time, until I began to get impatient with scales and with those everlasting exercises, and began to improvise and to play the way I wanted it." The lessons ended shortly thereafter. Telling the story decades later, Frances either claimed she refused to take them any more, or that she drove my poor teacher to distraction, until finally she informed my parents that she could no longer teach me anything. Frances found she could play by ear. She began with simple hymns in Sunday school, before tackling jazz tunes with some ukulele-playing high school friends. She also decided to work on her singing voice, and performed her first solo at church with In the Garden. This musical talent gave Frances grand ideas about her future. "I wanted to be a singer. I wanted to be a dancer. I wanted to be an artist. I used to draw and paint, freestyle. And I think most of all, I wanted to be an actress. I wanted to do anything that involved performing." Betty Sue and Walter had something more modest in mind for their daughter, becoming a piano or elementary school teacher. But even at a young age, Frances knew, "Oh no, that wasn't nearly enough for me." She pushed herself to not only keep up with her older classmates, but to surpass them. It came at a cost. At 11, I discovered that I had nerves, she later remembered. I had a nervous breakdown, plus a spot on a lung, possibly from tuberculosis. Frances spent the whole summer vacation in bed recovering. As she headed into her teenage years, her competitive streak extended from academics to landing the most popular boys to date. Her parents considered 13 too young and wanted her to wait. They tried to ridicule her into compliance. My family often laughed at my performances with the boys, and that stung me. I was sure I was old enough to do what I was doing. Frances forced a compromise. She asked Betty Sue to serve as a chaperone for the younger teenage girls like herself, who were not allowed to date, but wanted to attend the town dances at the courthouse in Osceola. Frances decided, though, not to look like someone who needed to have her behavior monitored. To appear older, she put a permanent wave in her hair and borrowed dresses from an indulgent aunt. Frances danced with boys under her mother's watchful eyes. Many asked her out, but Betty Sue and Walter Smith held firm to their conviction that she wait a few more years. They thought they had the situation under control. Then, 18-year-old Thomas Fox showed up. He motored over in his Chrysler Roadster from nearby Blytheville, a small, bustling cotton farming town in northeast Arkansas. Frances could not take her eyes off him when he walked into the dance. Tom was dashing and handsome with dark, serious eyes, she later recalled. They were both mad for the Charleston, and before long they were mad for each other. Frances ignored her parents' prohibition on dating and let Tom squire her around in his car to other dances and parties, hoping her parents would not find out. But they did, of course. Betty Sue may not have been surprised. She always said, "Frances is too impulsive. She means well, but she rushes into things before she thinks them through." Once the Smiths learned about their daughter's clandestine dating, they forbade her to see Tom. They may have been especially worried that his car provided them with too many opportunities to be alone and unchaperoned. An uncle tried to bribe Frances to stop seeing the young man by offering to send her to study music in Switzerland. But it was too late to reel me in, Frances admitted. Rebellion flared in my soul. She wanted Tom. Frances tried negotiating, the strategy that earned her those nights on the dance floor at the courthouse. This time her parents refused to budge. She could not date, especially someone 18 years old. Frances defied them and met Tom in secret at the homes of conspiring friends. On Friday, April 8, 1927, when she was supposed to be at a rehearsal for a high school play, she and Tom eloped. It must have been true love because Frances willingly gave up the limelight of appearing in one of the production's leading roles. The couple lied about their ages on the marriage license. They found a Baptist minister in Blytheville who did not look too closely at them or the document. Afterwards, we sped across the state line in his roadster to Tom's mother's house in Humboldt, Tennessee. We spent our honeymoon there, one weekend with his mother and his aunt. By the time the newlyweds arrived in Humboldt, guilt overrode Frances's excitement. She knew her parents would be frantic over her disappearance, so she telephoned home to announce the marriage. Her mother took the call. Never will I forget the awful, throbbing silence that followed. But it didn't last long, Frances remembered. Betty Sue said she forgave her daughter for the scare over her absence, then begged her to come home. My mother pleaded with me to go back to high school, since I was in the junior class and would graduate in another year. I refused. All I wanted then was to be a good wife and to start a home of my own. Tom delivered Frances out of the doldrums of a boring, childish high school life in Osceola and made her feel like an adult. Plus, he was handsome, enjoyed a good party, and was a marvelous dancer. Frances refused to give him up. That Betty Sue and Walter Smith declined to insist on an annulment indicated they likely worried their daughter married because of something more than true love. The young couple first lived with Tom's father and stepmother in Blytheville. The living arrangements proved less than ideal for Tom and Frances, affording them little privacy to get to know each other. Tom worked at the family's dry-cleaning business, where he increasingly chafed under his father's authority, and soon everyone in the crowded household learned an important piece of information about the newlyweds. Frances was pregnant. It is not clear exactly when she realized this. Frances later claimed she and Tom married in February rather than April, which suggests she worried about what people would say about a baby arriving not quite 8 months after the wedding. Tom and Frances might have engaged in premarital sex and decided to elope because of that, and in case she had become pregnant. If the two slept together prior to the wedding, they were part of a growing number of American couples to do so. During the 1920s, a younger generation of women, known as flappers, flaunted their sexuality by wearing short skirts, bobbing their hair, and applying makeup. They drove around unescorted, with young men who took them on dates to picture shows and speakeasies. Dating duos found quiet places, often in parked cars, where they kissed and petted, sexual activity that stopped short of intercourse. When a steady relationship developed with the understanding that marriage would follow, the engaged pair sometimes declined to wait until their wedding night to have sex. The fact of Frances's pregnancy might have injected an additional level of stress between the teenage couple and Tom's parents. Maybe they blamed Frances for tying their son down at a young age. They did not want the disruption of having a baby in the house. Tom decided he and his wife should try their luck in Memphis. A catastrophic flood had hit the city earlier in 1927, and Tom may have believed he could find something better than a dry-cleaning job while Memphis scrambled to restore itself. Frances enthusiastically agreed to the move. "I wanted adventure. I wanted to see the world and be sophisticated." A vibrant progressive city, the population of Memphis exceeded 100,000 by 1900. And through the 1920s, it surged toward 250,000. It boasted several railroad lines, trolley cars, and indoor electricity and plumbing. City leaders held modern political views and, in 1920, actively lobbied the state to ratify the women's suffrage amendment. Throughout the 1910s, the mayor flouted state prohibition laws and kept the city flowing with alcohol, enhancing local nightlife. Memphis's entertainment venues especially appealed to Frances, who considered them the epitome of high culture. By the 1920s, the city served as the center of modern music in the South. Living there, Frances believed would keep her passion for music lit. Beale Street, stretching nearly 2 miles from the Mississippi River to East Street, housed predominantly black-owned nightclubs, restaurants, and hotels. Its bars and clubs attracted the best blues and jazz musicians and singers, including Lizzie Douglas and Walter "Furry" Lewis, who brought in both black and white patrons. The popularity of black music pushed at the boundaries of racial segregation, but did not break them. Frances and Tom did not exactly strike out on their own. Their decision to settle in Memphis was likely made with the help of Betty Sue Smith, who also moved there in 1927. Her marriage to Walter, already strained because of his gambling, may have further deteriorated if they disagreed over how to respond to Frances's elopement. Clearly, Betty Sue wanted to help her daughter. What is not certain is how Walter felt about all this. Perhaps he believed Frances should fend for herself, accept the consequences of the decision she made. Maybe his unwillingness to assist their daughter gave Betty Sue the final push toward divorce. If Tom and Frances Fox ever lived on their own in Memphis, it was for a very short period. At some point, they moved into a modest 2-bedroom brick bungalow on Faxon Avenue, which they shared with Betty Sue and young Hillman. Tom found work easily enough, while Frances struggled with domestic chores. "I didn't know anything about keeping house. I didn't know anything about anything. I would try to cook for us, but it was awful. Lumpy cream gravy, burnt hamburgers." The anticipated evenings of music and dancing never materialized. With the cost of living much higher in Memphis than in Blytheville, The young couple rarely had enough extra money to spend in nightclubs.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?